Hey everybody, it's Global Politics with Jim Martin. Today I want to talk about coups, specifically coups in democratic countries and how those turned out in a historical perspective. So I'm going to try to keep this in the more modern era. There was, for instance, an attempted coup that was really a ham-handed mess during the Depression against FDR, a bumbling mess that never really materialized in any real way. We're going to keep this like post 1968, let's say. So one of the first ones that I want to talk about, the attempted coup in France in 1968. In May of 1968, early May, French students had been protesting a number of things over the years. Actually, my mother was kind of part of one of those protests, I think in the early 60s. So French students have been protesting a whole bunch of things just kind of constantly. It's France. These things happen if you watch the news at all. In a particular incident, the French police got pretty heavy-handed with dispersing one of these protests, and then it just sort of metastasized, and so many people started showing up. They were of the real socialist mindset, and so this basically started to paralyze France, and then the trade unions joined in. And this became a real challenge to the authority of the French government. And in fact, Charles de Gaulle, who was president of France at the time, had to flee. He and others were concerned that, this was the real deal. They were going to get overthrown. However, the French were able to mobilize enough police to kind of control the situation, and ultimately the government made a deal with the trade unions, which ended all the strikes, and things just kind of calmed down. The whole thing petered out in about a month. So by June, things were in a much different place. Government had made a number of concessions to the students and to the trade unions, and things just kind of calmed down, and that was the end of that. So in this case, democracy survived this attempted coup. Next, there was a interesting set of events that, if you've ever watched The Crown, it's kind of alluded to. In the 70s, Great Britain was in pretty dire financial straits. Things were not going well. Harold Macmillan, who was prime minister again, he'd been prime minister once in the 60s, prime minister again in the 70s, there were a couple of incidents where the military suddenly took over Heathrow Airport, which is, of course, the major international airport in England. And when that happened, he had not ordered that, and no one else appeared to have either. And what has emerged over time is that there was this cabal of newspaper publishers, conservative types, and former MI5 people who were engaged in this effort to have him resign or overthrow his government. And they were ordering these seizures of the airport as kind of a first step. However, no one else joined in. They actually attempted to get one of the royals involved, Lord Mountbatten, who was later assassinated by the IRA in the 80s. But he politely declined to participate, as did a few other people who would have lent some authority to the whole proceeding. And so nothing really came of that. However, it sort of achieved its objective in that this constant state of real paranoia really kind of did Macmillan in, and ultimately he resigned, citing just exhaustion. So in the second case, democracy also survived. The next few are not quite so hopeful. So Turkey is an interesting case of a country that transitioned to a democracy over a period of decades. And you have to kind of take a step back and think about the founding of the modern Turkish state to understand the full perspective here. So Ataturk founded the modern Turkish state after the Ottoman Empire collapsed after World War I. And one of the critical parts of his platform was to modernize Turkey and create it as a secular state, meaning that religious entities and such would not participate in the governance of the country, and that they would have a constitution and a whole bunch of things. Now, they weren't a democracy for a long time, but starting kind of in the 60s and into the 70s and 80s and such, they actually were. Now, the self-appointed protector of this secular, semi-democratic state was always the Turkish military. And they maintained through the Constitution and a number of other institutional features sort of a unspoken veto power over a lot of things that might happen in Turkey. Every once in a while, they would make some veiled threats through their spokespeople, and then every once in a while, they would actually have a coup and overthrow whoever the current government was, leading to a transitional period that then ended up with new elections and a new government. This happened in 1960, 1971, 1980, 1997, and ultimately they were successful in reinstalling these governments that were more friendly to the military and would uphold the Constitution and the secular nature of Turkey as a government. However, when Erdogan was elected, things began to shift. And the last coup, which was during the Obama administration, there was an attempted military coup which utterly failed. And as a result of that coup, Erdogan, who had assembled enough power, he changed the constitution, done some other things legally. He was then able to really cement his rule and, frankly, to liberalize the Turkish military so that it really reflected all of Turkish society rather than just a secular side of things. So Erdogan, not a great guy, but in some sense, in this case, perhaps a better move. That said, Turkey is clearly no longer a fully fledged democracy at this point, and I'm sure Erdogan would not want it to be so. As we witnessed yesterday, he had the mayor of Istanbul, who is a serious political rival, just about ready to challenge him for the presidency, get arrested suddenly on charges of corruption. When you happen to be a political threat, suddenly you're corrupt. So that's Turkey. So Turkey, sort of a cautionary tale, no longer a democracy. We can also talk about Venezuela as a sad tale. At one time in the 70s, Venezuela was seen as a fully consolidated democracy around the world by political scientists, economists, and everything else. They had elections, they had transfer of power, they had a very pluralistic society with multiple political parties. Things were going extremely well. Come along Hugo Chavez in the later 90s, and he decides with a bunch of ragtag military officers to have a coup. This coup failed utterly, just a complete mess. And he was arrested, put on trial, put into prison. He was in jail for a couple of years, and then once he got out, he declared himself, hey, I understand violence isn't the answer, all these things. He started a political party, which was based on the movement that had sponsored the coup in the first place, and ran for office and won. From that point on, he did everything in his power to crush the democratic institutions within Venezuela and basically turned the entire country into a giant mess. Whether his politics are leftists or whatever you want to call it, a lot of right-wing folks would say, oh, this is socialism in action. Actually, it's just authoritarianism. He took over and he started to do lots of things to punish his political enemies, to crush the press, to suppress the courts and arrest their equivalent of the Supreme Court. He nationalized a lot of industries. He seized land from landowners. And basically everybody who was rich fled the country. Clearly, democracy is no more in Venezuela under his successor, Maduro, either. That is a sad tale, to be sure. We can also talk about more gradual sorts of processes that have led democracies to become dictatorships or authoritarian regimes. Russia is an example of that. Vladimir Putin, elected, then gradually over a span of some years began to accumulate greater power, to change the Russian constitution, to do a number of things. And clearly, Russia is no longer a democracy in any way, shape, or form. It's a pure gangster kleptocracy, authoritarian regime from stem to stern. Another cautionary tale in the heart of Europe is Hungary. In Hungary, Viktor Orban, who'd really been around in a political sense for the entire history of Czechia as a free country, got himself involved in the Fidesz party early on and really was there from the beginning. He has gradually cemented the role of Fidesz as the leading party in Czechia, and himself as in the role of prime minister as a illiberal leader is what he would call it, emphasizing these things like traditional values and anti-LGBTQ things, anti-immigrant stuff, anti-EU stuff, pro-Russian things. He's had some support from outside on those things, and very popular with the American hard right. Hungary is no longer really a democracy. They still have elections. There's opposition. There's a very popular guy is running against him. Their elections aren't for another year or so. I would suspect, like we saw in Turkey, that said person will probably get into some corruption troubles and arrested and deported or whatever they happen to do to him. So Hungary has gone down that road to become an authoritarian regime under Viktor Orban, who is actually a relatively young man at this point. He's a little bit older than me. So I'm going to call that relatively young. Those are some kind of upsetting examples of how we should not take democracy for granted. It is always possible for forces within a society to organize, gather up, and overthrow the will of the majority of citizens. Cautionary tale to be sure. I hope you found that interesting. And if anybody has any context on those they want to share in the comments, please feel free to do so. Have a great day, and I'll talk to you again soon.